She was chained in the dark for 43 days. No sunlight, no food, nothing but the sound of rats and the slow drip of water through frozen stone. When Cole Mercer pried open that trapdoor, he wasn't looking for a person. He was looking for water rights to save a dying cattle herd. What he found instead was a woman who should have been dead, and a secret buried beneath that rotting ranch that was about to drag every man in the valley to his grave. This is the story of Black Hollow Ridge, and it gets much worse before it gets better. If this story pulls you in, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this reaches. Stay with me until the end. You won't regret it. The winter of 1889 came down on the Montana Territory like something personal. Not the ordinary kind of cold that settled into your bones and made you miserable. This was the kind of cold that killed livestock in their sleep, froze streams solid from bank to bank, and convinced even experienced mountain men that maybe, just maybe, they'd made a wrong turn somewhere in their lives. The kind of winter that made a man question whether the land he'd chosen actually wanted him there. Cole Mercer had been questioning that for about 3 years now. He stood in the stirrups of his gray horse, a raw-boned animal named Hatch, who had survived worse winters than this and was starting to seem personally offended by the current one, and looked out across the flat expanse of the valley floor from the tree line above. His breath came out in thick clouds. His beard had ice in it. The rifle across his saddle horn was so cold the metal burned through his glove if he gripped it wrong. Below him, at the bottom of a gentle slope crusted with 6 inches of packed snow, sat the Crow property. Even from 200 yards, it looked wrong. Most abandoned homesteads had a particular kind of stillness to them, a quiet that felt earned, like the land was just exhaling after years of being worked too hard. But the Crow place had a different quality. The silence around it felt held, tense, like something underneath the surface was waiting to see what you would do next. The farmhouse was a low, dark structure with a stone chimney and a porch roof that had partially collapsed under the weight of an early November snowfall. 2 of the windows were blown out, the frames dark and jagged like missing teeth. The barn behind it had fared a little better. The roof was mostly intact, but the doors had come off their hinges and were lying at odd angles in the snow, half buried. Cole had heard about the Crow place for months before he ever considered buying it. What he'd heard wasn't good. Silas Crow had run cattle in this valley for going on 15 years before he abruptly vanished in the early fall of '89. Nobody knew exactly what had happened to him. Some people said he'd ridden south and gotten himself killed in a card game down in Billings. Some people said he'd moved his operation to Wyoming, though nobody could say who'd seen him do it. A couple of the older ranchers in town spoke about him in hushed tones and changed the subject quickly when pressed, which Cole had always found more informative than anything anyone actually said out loud. What he did know for certain, Silas Crow had been the kind of man other men were careful around. Big, quiet, with a way of looking at you that made you aware of the exact distance between your hand and whatever weapon you were carrying. Cole had met him exactly once, at a cattle auction in Great Falls 2 years prior, and had spent the rest of the afternoon making sure he was never in the same part of the building. That said, Cole was a practical man, and the Crow property had water rights. That was the thing about winter on the frontier. It had a way of making you set aside certain feelings about certain people. Cole's own spread, a modest operation about 12 miles to the north called Timber Ridge, was sitting on the wrong side of a watershed divide. The creek that ran through his upper pasture dried to almost nothing every summer and trickled down to essentially useless every January. He'd lost 11 head last winter to dehydration and cold combined, which wasn't a number a rancher with a herd of 60 could sustain for very long, without the whole enterprise starting to slide in a direction that ended with him selling the property and going back to wherever he came from. He wasn't going back. He had nowhere to go, so he'd made inquiries with the county land office in early November. The Crow property had no clear title holder at present. Silas had never filed a will, had no living relatives anyone could locate, and had apparently owed a substantial sum in back taxes that the county was becoming impatient about. A price had been negotiated, papers had been drawn up, and Cole had signed them last Tuesday in a cramped county office that smelled like tobacco and old wood and the particular type of anxiety that lives in government buildings. The property was his now. All he had to do was assess it. He nudged Hatch down the slope, letting the horse pick his way carefully through the snow. Hatch was not an enthusiastic animal. He expressed most of his opinions through subtle ear movements, and a way of sighing that seemed specifically designed to make Cole feel guilty. And right now, both ears were rotated backward, and he was exhaling through his nose with considerable emphasis. "I know," Cole said. The horse had no further comment. "Beau passé, c'est beau dans ce pont." He tied Hatch to the porch railing, what was left of it, and stood for a moment looking at the front door. It was still on its hinges, which was something. A storm had pushed it partially inward so that it stood at a slight angle. An inch of snow accumulated on the threshold below it. Cole pushed it open with the butt of his rifle and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Not rot exactly. Not the ordinary smell of a house left to the cold for a few months. There was something underneath the damp wood and the mineral smell of frozen stone. Something darker. Iron and old smoke, and something else he couldn't name immediately. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck respond before his brain had the chance to process why. He stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust. The front room was a wreck. Not the casual kind of disorder that accumulates in a working ranch house. This was the aftermath of something violent. A chair had been broken apart. The pieces scattered across the floor, one leg wedged under the far wall as though it had been thrown with considerable force. The table was on its side. 2 of the 3 oil lamps had been pulled from their brackets on the walls and smashed on the floor, the glass long since frozen into the rough wood. Cole moved further inside, stepping carefully. Along the left wall, beneath a window, someone had clawed at the wood paneling hard enough to leave deep furrows in the pine. Long, ragged scratches that ran at a slight upward angle, like something being dragged and fighting against it. Not an animal. The spacing and depth were wrong for an animal. He crouched and looked at the floor near the kitchen doorway. Dark stains, old and frozen into the grain of the wood. He'd been around enough violence to know what he was looking at without having to wonder about it. Cole straightened up slowly. "Hell," he said quietly, to no one. He moved through the kitchen, stepping over a fallen shelf and the scattered remains of dry goods. An overturned flour sack, a smashed tin of lard, a cast iron skillet lying face down on the floor as though someone had dropped it in a hurry. The cold was brutal in here, coming through the blown-out window above the dry sink in steady waves. He almost missed it. He was turning to check the back wall when his boot caught on something, and he looked down and saw the iron ring set flush into the kitchen floor, half buried under the edge of a rag rug that had been kicked askew. A trap door. Padlocked with a heavy iron lock that had a keyhole coated in what looked like black wax, as though someone had sealed it deliberately against the cold, or against a smell. Cole stood over it for a moment. A rational man with practical concerns about water rights and winter livestock management would note its existence, file it away as something to deal with later, and continue the assessment of the property. A rational man would assume it was a root cellar or a cold storage space, probably empty, probably of no interest at all. Cole was not, in his experience, entirely rational. He pulled the rag rug aside fully and knelt down. The lock was substantial, the kind meant to resist being shot off, with a thick shackle and a body made of cast iron rather than the softer alloys that were common on cheaper hardware. He put his hand flat on the trap door and held it there. Nothing. He started to stand up. That was when he heard it. Not loud, not even clearly distinct from the ambient noise of the wind through the broken window and the creak of the damaged roof above him. It was barely a sound at all, more like a shift in the quality of the silence beneath the floor. A small, muffled exhalation that might have been human. Might have been. Cole stayed perfectly still. It came again, faint and rough, like someone who'd been breathing in short, careful increments for a very long time and had just barely enough strength left to be heard. He grabbed the padlock and pulled hard. It held. He pulled again, throwing his weight into it, and the iron ring creaked, but the trapdoor stayed. He stood up, scanned the kitchen, found the skillet on the floor, picked it up, and spent 45 seconds battering the lock until it gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty house. He hauled the trapdoor open. The smell that came up from below was enough to make him take 2 steps backward, cold and dark and human in the worst possible ways. Unwashed skin and old blood, and the flat mineral smell of stone that had never seen sunlight. He pulled the bandana from around his neck, pressed it over his nose, and forced himself to look down. Stone steps. A narrow cellar. Darkness almost complete. "Hello?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. A long pause. Then a voice from below, barely above a whisper, hoarse and dry as old parchment. Please. Just the one word. Cole went down the steps. She was in the far corner. He almost didn't see her at first. She'd pressed herself back against the stone wall so completely that she blended with the shadows, and the only thing that resolved her as a person was the faint gleam of the chains. Iron manacles, old style, bolted to a ring in the wall by a length of heavy chain that gave her maybe 6 feet of movement in any direction. 6 feet. That was the world she'd been living in. Cole stood at the bottom of the steps and looked at her and had to work very hard for a moment to keep his expression from doing something she might misread as pity, because she looked like she was waiting to see if he would use pity against her, and had made certain preparations for exactly that. She was young, mid-20s maybe. Hard to say under the circumstances. Her hair was dark and had gone to knots and tangles so severe they looked almost deliberate, as though the cold and the confinement had decided to turn her hair into a record of how long she'd been here. She was wearing what had once been a good dress, the kind a woman wore for travel or business, now reduced to a filthy, torn wreck of fabric that had stopped functioning as real clothing some time ago. Her face was pale with the kind of pallor that goes beyond cold, the translucent quality of real starvation, where you start to be able to see the structure of the skull beneath the skin. But her eyes were completely, disturbingly alert. She was watching him with the focused intensity of someone who'd had nothing to do for weeks but study the people who came down those stairs, and she'd gotten very good at it. "You're not one of his men," she said. Her voice was a wreck, cracked and barely audible, but there was nothing imprecise about the statement. It wasn't a question. "No," Cole said. "How'd you get in?" "Bought the property." A pause. Something moved through her expression that he couldn't read. "You bought it?" "From the county, 3 days ago." She looked at him for a long time. Her arms were pulled slightly inward by the chain's weight, and he could see where the manacles had worn the skin around her wrists raw even through the cold. She was shaking, not dramatically, but steadily, the kind of trembling that a body does when it's been cold for so long that warmth has become a theoretical concept rather than something it can actually remember. "There's a key," she said carefully. He kept it on a nail above the stair, 3rd step from the top, left side. Cole went back up the stairs, found the nail, found the key, a small flat thing that had been hanging there long enough to rust slightly at the loop. He went back down. She watched him approach without moving. Up close, he could see her breathing, shallow and deliberate. The careful breathing of someone managing pain. He found the lock on the right manacle, got the key in, turned it. The manacle fell away. She made a sound, short, involuntary, and brought her arm in against her chest and just held it there. Cole waited, giving her that moment without comment. Then he moved to the left side. When both manacles were off, she sat against the wall and looked at her wrists with a careful, clinical expression, as though they belonged to someone else and she was assessing the damage neutrally. "Can you walk?" Cole asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I haven't tried in several days." "We'll find out." He crouched down to her level, because standing over her seemed like the wrong thing to do right now. "What's your name?" She looked at him steadily. "Evelyn Marlowe." The name didn't register immediately, and then it did. Marlowe. As in Thomas Marlowe, the land attorney who'd been found dead outside of Helena 3 months ago. As in the Marlowe land estate, which held the title to approximately 40% of the water-bearing pasture land in this part of the valley, and had been the subject of a fairly dramatic legal dispute that Cole had heard discussed at the general store in town more than once. He kept his face neutral. "Cole Mercer," he said. "I have a horse outside, and a cabin 12 miles north." 12 miles, she said, with the particular tone of someone doing arithmetic in difficult conditions. "Storm's moving in. We should start now." She looked at him for one more long moment. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find enough of it to proceed with. "Help me up," she said. Getting her up the stairs took longer than it should have. Her legs had been folded in the same position for so long that when she first tried to put weight on them, nothing happened. Not a collapse, just a complete absence of response, like the connection between her brain and her lower body had been interrupted. Cole held her arm without squeezing and let her work through it, watching her jaw tighten each time she tried to override the cramping and the stiffness through sheer determination. She made no sound except the occasional sharp exhale. On the fourth try, she got both feet under her and managed to stand, swaying dramatically and grabbing his arm with a grip that was much stronger than he'd expected given everything. "I've got you," he said. "I've got myself," she said immediately. He almost smiled. They made it up the stairs and through the kitchen and out the front door in about 4 times the time it would have taken either of them alone. Hatch turned his head and regarded the pair of them with mild alarm, then returned to staring at the snow with his characteristic expression of general dissatisfaction. Evelyn stopped on the porch steps and looked up. The sky above the valley was a heavy pewter color, bruised at the northern horizon where the incoming storm was stacking up over the mountains. The light was thin and sideways, the kind that came in the last few hours before a front moved through, when everything looked a little too defined, like the world was showing you its details one last time before erasing them. She stood there for a moment with her eyes closed and her face turned up to what light there was. He didn't rush her. When she opened her eyes, they were wet, but her expression hadn't changed. She brought her sleeve across her face briskly and looked at the horse. "I may need help mounting," she said. The admission seemed to cost her something. "That's fine," Cole said. He helped her up, then swung up behind her. It was going to be a tight ride and a cold one, and 12 miles in the weather that was coming was not going to be comfortable. He pulled his coat around them both as much as he could manage and turned Hatch north toward the tree line. They'd been riding for maybe 10 minutes when she spoke. "He's still out there?" Her voice was flat and factual. Not frightened, or rather, not allowing itself to be frightened, which he was beginning to understand was how she operated. "Silas Crow," Cole said. Not a question. "Yes." "You think he'll come back to the property?" A pause. "When he finds out someone's been in that house, he'll come back to more than just the property." She paused again. "He'll come back with men." Cole kept his eyes on the trail ahead, where the first thin snow was starting to fall from the darkening sky. The flakes were small and dry, the kind that came at the front edge of a serious storm. "Tell me what he took," Cole said. She was quiet for a moment. "Everything," she said. "He took everything." Bolt. The storm hit about 4 miles from the cabin. Not gradually. It came down like a door slamming, the wind picking up from almost nothing to something that bent the pines at the slope's edge and drove the snow horizontally so that the world shrank to about 15 feet in every direction. Hatch put his head down and kept moving with the resigned fortitude of an animal that had made its peace with misery. Cole kept one arm around Evelyn and felt her shivering in a way that was different from the earlier trembling, bigger, less controlled, her body's emergency reserves starting to draw down. She was burning everything she had left just to stay upright. "How much further?" she asked through her teeth. 20 minutes. She didn't respond. She straightened her spine slightly, and that was her response. The cabin at Timber Ridge was not an impressive structure by any objective measure. Cole had built it himself 3 years ago from pine logs he'd cut on the upper slope. And while it was solid and weatherproof and had been designed by someone who understood cold winters at altitude, it was not a large space. One main room with a fireplace that took up most of the north wall, a sleeping loft accessed by a crude ladder, a small enclosed porch at the east end that functioned as a cold storage area in winter. The kind of place built for function rather than comfort, where every design decision had been made by asking what would keep a man alive and then stopping right there. Cole got Evelyn inside while Hatch protested vigorously about being tied in the leaning, wind-hammered lean-to instead of being somewhere warm. Cole had a brief and unsympathetic conversation with the horse about the realities of frontier life, secured him as well as he could, and went inside. Evelyn was sitting in the chair nearest the fireplace, the only chair actually, with her hands pressed flat on her knees and her eyes moving around the room the way a person's eyes move when they're trying to assess a new situation from a position of extreme vulnerability. Cole built the fire without speaking, letting the cabin do the work of warming first. The pine caught quickly, and within a few minutes the orange light was filling the room and the temperature was starting to come up from a dead start. He got water heating. He found the dried venison he'd hung last month and cut several strips from it. He put a blanket over her shoulders without making a production of it. She took it without comment. She ate slowly, carefully, in the way that people eat when they know their bodies have forgotten the rules and eating too fast has consequences. Cole watched her without appearing to watch her and drank his coffee and said nothing. After a while, the shivering slowed. After a while longer, something in the set of her shoulders changed. Not relaxing exactly, more like standing down from a particular kind of alert. "I need to tell you what he stole," she said. "You don't have to do that tonight." "I need to." Her voice was stronger now, the warm food and the fire doing their work. "Because you bought that property, and you're already involved whether you chose to be or not, and you deserve to understand what that means." Cole set his coffee down and looked at her directly. She held his gaze with no difficulty whatsoever. "My father was a land attorney," she began. "Thomas Marlowe. He spent 20 years acquiring water rights and range easements throughout this part of the territory on behalf of the ranching families here. Not for his own benefit. He structured the deeds so that the rights were held collectively through a series of documented agreements. Every family in this valley has grazing and water access because of those agreements." She paused. "The original deeds are in a document case. Silas Crow and the men he works with stole that case after murdering my father's associate, a man named Raymond Fossey, who was delivering the documents to the county recorder." Another pause. "They took me because I know the documents well enough to contest any forgeries. They didn't want me dead. They wanted me inaccessible, unable to appear before a court, unable to testify." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Where's the document case now?" She pressed her lips together. "Hidden. Inside the ranch. I overheard Silas talking. He said it was still in the cellar, in the walls somewhere. He hadn't decided where to move it yet." "You were in that cellar for 43 days. Cole looked at his hands. "Fossey was killed in September," Evelyn continued. "Silas took me from my father's house in Helena 2 days later. My father was away. He doesn't know where I am. He probably—" She stopped, cleared her throat. "He probably thinks I'm dead. He's probably been looking. He has money and connections. It's why Silas has been careful." She pulled the blanket more tightly around her shoulders. "Cole, those documents are the only proof that the valley's water rights belong to the ranching families and not to whoever Silas is working with. If they're destroyed or successfully forged, every rancher in this valley loses their water access and eventually their land. Hundreds of families." Cole got up and poked at the fire, sending a small cascade of sparks up the chimney. "You said the men he works with," he said. "Who are they?" "I don't know all of them. I know there are businessmen in Helena involved, and at least one person from my father's inner circle." Her expression tightened. "Someone who knew exactly where the documents were kept." Cole stared into the fire for a moment. "He'll know by now," he said. "Silas. He'll know someone opened that trap door." "Yes. How long before he comes north?" "He has to gather his men, figure out who bought the property, trace it back to you." She paused. 2 days? Maybe 3 if the storm holds." The storm outside was at full volume now, rattling the cabin shutters with considerable intensity. Cole turned and looked at Evelyn Marlowe, sitting in his one chair with a blanket around her shoulders and wrists that looked like they'd gone several rounds with iron manacles, and thought about how she'd eaten slowly and carefully because her body had forgotten how food worked, and about how she'd said, "I've got myself," when he'd told her he had her. "You should sleep," he said. "I'm not tired. You've been chained in a stone cellar for 43 days. I'm aware of how long it's been." He looked at her. "I'm also not going to sleep on the first night in a room with a door that opens from the inside," she said quietly. Not as a complaint, just as a fact about herself, delivered without apology. Cole understood that. He got up and pulled the wooden bar across the door, the iron bracket dropping into place with a solid sound. "Nobody's coming through that tonight," he said. "Storm's got the trails closed from here to the ridge." Evelyn looked at the barred door. Something crossed her face that was hard to define. Not relief exactly, more like the first faint relaxation of a muscle that had been tightly contracted for so long it had forgotten any other state. "The loft is warmer," he said. "You take it, I'll sleep down here." She looked like she was going to argue. Then she looked at the ladder. "All right," she said. She climbed it slowly, favoring her right side, and disappeared into the darkness above. Cole heard the soft rustling of her settling into the straw mattress. He sat down in the chair and pulled his rifle across his knees. Outside, the storm hammered the mountain with everything it had. Inside, the fire crackled and popped and kept the cold at a reasonable distance. Cole stayed awake most of the night, listening to the wind, listening to Evelyn Marlowe breathe steadily in the loft above him, thinking about a padlocked trap door and scratches on a wall, and the particular sound of a voice that had almost given up. Please. He thought about Silas Crow riding north through the snow with blood on his mind. He thought about 43 days in a stone cellar. He thought about all the families in the valley below who didn't know yet how close they were to losing everything. At some point before dawn, the storm began to ease, and Cole Mercer, who had spent 3 years doing nothing more ambitious than keeping a modest cattle herd alive on an isolated mountain spread, sat in his one chair in his one-room cabin and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that surviving the wilderness alone was something he had already learned to do. What was coming was something else entirely. The storm broke some time before first light, and by morning the mountain was buried under 14 inches of new snow and a silence so complete it almost felt like a reprieve. Almost. Cole was already up when Evelyn came down the ladder, moving more steadily than the night before, but still favoring her right side in a way that told him something in her ribs or hip hadn't fully forgiven her for the last 6 weeks. He had coffee on and a pot of oatmeal working on the iron stove plate, and he said nothing about the fact that she'd slept for almost 11 hours, which seemed like the decent thing to do. She sat down at the small table near the window and looked out at the white expanse of the slope. The pine trees were heavy with snow, their branches bowed low, the whole mountain wearing the exhausted stillness of something that had been fighting hard and had finally stopped for a moment. "It'll be passable by afternoon," she said. "Yeah, which means he can start moving by tomorrow." "That's what I figured." She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug, slowly, carefully, still working on making her fingers do what she asked, and stared out the window for a while. Cole put the oatmeal in a bowl and set it in front of her without ceremony, and she ate it the same way she'd eaten the venison the night before, methodical, determined not to rush. Like eating was something she had to relearn the rules of from the beginning. He refilled his own coffee and leaned against the wall near the door and thought. The arithmetic was not encouraging. He had one rifle, a good one, a Winchester Model 1886 that he'd saved for 2 years to buy, and a Colt revolver that he'd carried for so long it had worn a groove in the leather of his holster. He had enough ammunition to handle the usual problems a mountain spread presented. The occasional predator, the once-a-season trip to town, but not enough for a sustained fight with multiple men. He had the terrain, which was worth something. He knew every crease and tree line on this part of the mountain better than he knew anything else in his life. Against that he had Silas Crow, who had been operating in this valley for 15 years and had not gotten away with what he'd gotten away with by being careless. Cole was still running the numbers when Evelyn said, without looking up from her bowl, "We're not running." He looked at her. "I know that's what you're thinking," she said. She finally looked up. "Take her into the northern wilderness. Ride hard. Wait it out. Let the legal system eventually do what the legal system does. Maybe get someone to look into it. Maybe not. In the meantime, Silas destroys those documents, and the question of who owns the valley's water rights becomes very difficult to answer correctly." "That's not entirely what I was thinking." "What were you thinking then?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking about ammunition." She held his eyes. "We need to go back for those documents. The ranch is 20 miles from here in open country. I know how far it is. I spent 6 weeks looking at the same 16 feet of stone wall, Cole. I know the geography down there better from memory than most people know their own front yards." She set the spoon down. "The deed is in the cellar wall. There's a section of stonework on the north face, 3rd row up from the floor, maybe 8 feet east of where the chain was anchored. 2 of the stones are loose. I could hear them shift whenever the temperature changed. You think that's where he put it?" "I know that's where he put it. The night before the last time he came down, I heard him through the trap door talking to one of his men. He said he'd sealed it behind the north wall, and it would stay there until spring when they could move it properly." Cole thought about the cellar. He'd been in it for maybe 90 seconds before he'd focused entirely on getting Evelyn out of it. He hadn't looked at the walls particularly. "If we go back down there and he's already sent someone ahead, then we deal with it." She said it without bravado, just a flat assessment. "Cole, the families in this valley don't know what's happening to them yet. They think they still have their land and their water and their agreements. They don't know that those agreements have been stolen and will be forged the moment Silas decides the timing is right. Some of those families have been on that land for 30 years. She paused. My father spent his career protecting them. He spent everything he had on those agreements. And then someone put a knife in Raymond Foss and threw those documents in a hole and chained me in the dark and told me that none of it meant anything anymore. The cabin was quiet for a moment except for the faint settling of the fire. I'm not running, she said again. Quieter this time. I understand if you are. You didn't sign up for this. You bought a property with water rights and found more than you bargained for, and nobody would blame you for deciding this isn't your problem. Cole looked at her steadily. I didn't say anything about running, he said. She held his gaze. I said I was thinking about ammunition, he said. Those are different things. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite relief, not gratitude either, more like the slight recalibration of a person who has been alone with a bad situation for so long that they've stopped fully expecting anyone to stand on the same side of it. All right, she said. We go back for the documents, Cole said, but we don't go today and we don't go tomorrow. You need 2 more days before you're in any shape to ride hard if it comes to that. And I need to fortify this cabin in case they find us here before we find them. She thought about that. He could see her working through the objection that 2 days was time they might not have, and then working through the counter to that, and arriving at the same reluctant conclusion he had. 2 days, she agreed. Oh, what? Those 2 days were not comfortable. On the first morning, Cole walked the perimeter of the cabin and the surrounding terrain with the focused attention of a man who had spent years reading landscape and understanding what it was telling him. The cabin sat in a natural clearing on the upper slope, backed against a granite outcropping on the north side that made approach from that direction essentially impossible. A man would have to come down from above, and above was nothing but vertical rock face for 100 feet. To the east, a dense stand of mature pine ran close enough to the structure that anyone moving through it would be audible in still air. To the west, open slope dropping away toward the valley, which gave a clear line of sight for several hundred yards, but also meant anyone approaching from that direction would be visible well in advance. The south face was the problem, a shallow draw that cut down toward the lower trail, with enough cover in the willows along its edge to conceal several men if they moved carefully. Cole spent most of that first afternoon working on the south problem. He pulled the hunting traps from the storage shed, 4 heavy bear traps and 6 of the smaller leg hold designs he used for predators, and set them in a staggered pattern through the willow stand, staggered so that a man moving through in the dark would have to be very lucky to avoid all of them. He covered each one with a thin layer of snow, working without gloves for the final placement so he didn't leave a scent on the trigger mechanisms that would alert an experienced tracker. His hands were numb to the wrists by the time he finished. Evelyn watched him from the cabin doorway for a while. He expected her to comment on the traps, their brutality, their indiscriminate nature, something. She didn't. What else? She said. Trip lines on the east side. I've got a spool of wire in the shed. Show me. He looked at her. She was still pale, still moving with the careful economy of someone whose body was operating on reduced resources, but her eyes were sharp and her jaw was set in a way that had become familiar to him in a short time. You've done this before, he said. Not accusatory, just surprised. My father's property in Helena was threatened twice before I was born. He used to tell me about it. I asked questions. A slight pause. I asked a lot of questions. Cole brought the wire spool from the shed. They spent the rest of the afternoon stringing it through the eastern tree line at 2 heights, shin level and knee level, connected at various points to tin cups from the cabin's shelving that would rattle loud enough to hear from inside with the door closed. Not elegant, not military grade, but workable at 3 a.m. when the wind was down and a man was moving quietly through pine trees thinking he hadn't been heard. Firing positions, Evelyn said as they came back to the cabin in the fading light. Cole pointed. The window on the east wall gives me a clean angle into the tree line for about 60 yards. The porch overhang blocks high approach from the west, but if I'm on the roof. It's an option. She looked at the roof. It was steeply pitched pine board, currently carrying about 8 inches of snow. You'd be exposed up there. I'd have height and angle. You'd also be a very visible target in daylight. Cole looked at the roof and then back at her. You're right, he said without making anything of it. The window, she said. And the east wall. Is there a gun port or... There's a gap in the chinking on the south wall that I never got around to fixing, about an inch wide. I can see the draw from it. So can they. It faces south. They'd have to know it was there. She thought about that, working through angles and distances with the same methodical focus she seemed to apply to everything. Cole watched her doing it and thought that it was a particular kind of strange to be standing in the snow outside his own cabin discussing firing positions with a woman he'd pulled from chains 24 hours ago. He also thought that he was genuinely glad she was here, which was its own kind of strange. On the second day, she talked. Not all at once, and not because she'd decided to. It came out in pieces while they worked, between tasks, in the unstructured way that conversation happens between people who are sharing a small space and a large problem. Cole asked questions where he had them, and stayed quiet where he didn't, and she seemed to appreciate the distinction. Her father, Thomas Marlowe, had been building the Valley's land trust for 20 years. The documents in question weren't simply deeds. They were a network of interlocking agreements, some of them negotiated across 2 generations of families, that collectively established water access rights and range easements for over 30 ranching operations. Individually, each family's claim was defensible but vulnerable to the kind of sustained legal challenge that required deep pockets to fight. Collectively, through the trust Thomas had built, they were essentially inviolable. The agreements cross-referenced each other in ways that meant attacking one required attacking all of them simultaneously. Which was, Evelyn explained quietly, exactly why the documents had to be stolen rather than simply contested. Someone understood the structure of the trust well enough to know that, Cole said. They were inside, she at the table and him on the floor near the fireplace, cleaning the Winchester. That's not Silas. No, she said. Silas is a capable man in certain ways. He's not a lawyer. So who built the plan? She turned her mug between her palms. Someone with access to my father's files. Someone who understood the legal architecture well enough to see the vulnerability. Steal the originals, forge the key documents, flood the county recorder with the forgeries while the originals are unavailable, then challenge the remaining family claims one at a time from a position that appears legally sound. She paused. It would take months to untangle even if you knew it was happening. And if nobody knew it was happening until the forgeries were already filed, the families would be defending the wrong thing. Exactly. Cole finished working the action of the rifle and looked up. Who had access to your father's files? The silence that followed had a specific quality to it. Not hesitation, more like the pause before lifting something heavy. Preparing. A small number of people, she said carefully. His assistant, his junior partners, and his personal accountant, a man named Edwin Barrett, who has worked with my father for 12 years and who is probably the person my father trusts most in the world outside of family. Cole looked at her. I don't know, she said, before he could ask the question. I don't know if it's Barrett. I don't have proof of anything. But I know the structure of my father's trust was not something most people understood, and I know Barrett understood it as well as anyone. She set the mug down. I also know that in the 3 months before Fossey was killed, Barrett had been unusually interested in the specifics of the water rights documentation. My father mentioned it. He thought Barrett was being thorough. And now? She looked at him steadily. Now I'm not sure what to think. Cole put the rifle down and leaned his back against the stone face of the fireplace and thought about that. A man Evelyn's father trusted with 12 years of his work and his livelihood. A man who would know exactly what to take and exactly how to use it. A man who could orchestrate the whole thing from a comfortable distance while Silas Crow did the parts that got hands dirty. You haven't told me how you ended up in that cellar, Cole said. She was quiet for a moment. Silas came to the house in Helena 2 days after Fossey was killed. I was there alone. My father was in Missoula on business. He knew I'd be alone. A pause. He was polite about it, which was somehow worse than if he hadn't been. He told me I was going to come with him and that if I made noise, the housekeeper would be hurt. I believed him. You were right to. I know. Another pause. I fought him when we got to the horses. It didn't accomplish very much. He's considerably larger than he looks. She touched the side of her face briefly, an unconscious gesture. The ride to Black Hollow took 2 days. I was in the cellar by nightfall of the second day. Cole said nothing for a moment. He came down twice a week, she continued. Left food and water. Never answered questions. The last time he came down was 11 days before you found me. She stopped. I was rationing what I had left. The fire popped and settled. Cole stared at it. He thought you'd run out before anyone found the place, Cole said. Yes. Her voice was flat and even. That was the plan. He looked at her. She met his eyes without flinching, without asking for anything in the expression. She had put the fact down between them like a stone, simply and without embellishment, and she was letting it sit there. He miscalculated, Cole said. He did, she said. On several things. Just it. Late in the evening of the second day, they heard the first riders. Not close. A sound carried on the cold air from somewhere down the lower trail, the creak of tack and the muffled percussion of hooves on packed snow. Cole was at the east window with the rifle before the sound had fully registered. Evelyn was up from the table and had his revolver in her right hand, standing back from the south wall near the unfilled chinking gap. They stood like that for almost 10 minutes. The sound didn't come any closer. It moved laterally, south toward the valley floor, and then disappeared. Cole let out a slow breath and lowered the rifle slightly. Scouting, Evelyn said quietly. Probably. He looked at her. She was holding the revolver with both hands, the grip correct, the muzzle down at a 30-degree angle. Not pointed at anything, not waving around, just held, ready, controlled. He hadn't taught her that. She already knew it. You can shoot, he said. My father insisted. She looked at the revolver. He said a woman alone on the frontier who couldn't shoot was an invitation for the worst kind of trouble. He was right. He was right about a lot of things. A slight pause. Except, possibly, about Barrett. She handed the revolver back to him when he crossed the room, handle first, and he reholstered it and checked the window one more time. Nothing moving on the slope. The night was clear and cold, and absolutely still. Tomorrow, he said. Yes, she said. Tomorrow we go back down. Cole checked the bar on the door, checked the windows, went to the south wall and put his eye to the gap in the chinking and saw nothing but snow and darkness and the far shadow of the willow stand 100 yards below. He turned back to the room. Evelyn was standing near the fireplace, not sitting, her arms crossed over her chest and her eyes focused on something that wasn't in the room with them, working through it. The route down the mountain, the layout of the cellar, the location of the stones, running the numbers the same way he had 2 nights ago, arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusions. She was not a woman who had been broken by 43 days in a stone cellar. She was a woman who had spent 43 days in a stone cellar building a plan, and who had been waiting ever since for the conditions to execute it. Cole understood that now in a way he hadn't when he'd pried that trapdoor open. He'd thought he was rescuing someone. He was starting to understand that the more accurate version was that he had arrived at the right moment for a plan that had been waiting for a participant. Get some sleep, he said. I know, she said, without moving. Then, a moment later, Cole. He looked at her. Thank you, she said. Just that. No elaboration, no further qualification. She said it the way someone says a thing they mean precisely and don't want dressed up. Don't thank me yet, he said. She almost smiled. Almost. She went up the ladder. Cole sat down with the rifle across his knees and listened to the mountain and thought about the riders he'd heard on the lower trail, moving in the dark like men who knew this country or were learning it fast. He thought about the willow stand and the traps under the snow and the wire in the eastern tree line. He thought about a document hidden behind loose stones in a burned-out cellar and a man named Edwin Barrett sitting somewhere warm, probably, waiting for news that hadn't arrived yet. He thought about tomorrow. Outside, somewhere on the lower slope, a branch broke under its load of snow with a crack like a rifle shot, and the sound rang out across the silent mountain and faded into nothing. Cole did not sleep. They rode out before dawn. The temperature had dropped overnight to somewhere that made the air feel solid, the kind of cold that got into your lungs and stayed there, and Hatch expressed his feelings about this with his full repertoire of ear movements and sighing. Cole had packed light, ammunition, rope, the hunting knife he carried in his boot, a small amount of food and water in his saddlebag. Evelyn had braided her hair back and tied it, and she'd taken his spare coat from the peg near the door without asking, which was the right call because her own was thin and half destroyed, and the mountain didn't care about circumstances. They didn't talk much on the ride down. The trail was icy in the narrow stretches where the tree cover had kept the snow from settling evenly, and Hatch needed his attention on the footing, and the sound of voices carrying in still mountain air was something neither of them needed to think about twice. Evelyn rode behind Cole with one hand on his shoulder for balance. Not gripping, just resting, a point of contact that was practical rather than anything else, and kept her eyes on the tree line the way he'd noticed she did everything, with a thoroughness that missed almost nothing. They were 2 miles down the slope when she said quietly, close to his ear, "Someone's been through here." Cole had already seen it, boot tracks in the snow on the eastern edge of the trail, partially filled by overnight drift but still readable. 2 sets, maybe 3, moving downhill. Recent enough. They hadn't come up to the cabin, which meant they'd either found what they were looking for on the lower trail, or they'd been surveying and pulled back. Neither option was comfortable. He kept Hatch moving and said nothing, and she said nothing, and they came down out of the pine line onto the flat approach to the valley floor as the sky above the eastern ridge was turning the thin gray color that precedes dawn by about 40 minutes. The Crow Ranch sat 1.5 miles ahead. Even at this distance, something looked wrong. Cole pulled Hatch up and looked carefully. "Smoke," he said. Evelyn saw it too. A thin, dark thread rising from the vicinity of the barn, caught in the still air and going straight up. Not a large fire. Something contained. A lamp or a brazier, maybe, inside the barn, which meant someone was keeping warm in there, which meant they'd arrived ahead of them. Cole thought about that for a moment. "How many men does Silas typically run with?" he asked. "I saw 4 different men during the time I was held there," Evelyn said. "He may have more. He pays mercenary work, so the numbers can change." A pause. "He won't come with fewer than 6. Not for something like this." 6, at minimum." Cole looked at the ranch buildings. The barn to the left, the farmhouse to the right, the cold storage shed at the back, all of it sitting in the gray pre-dawn light with a particular stillness that could mean abandoned or could mean waiting. And those 2 things looked nearly identical from 200 yards. "We can't go at the cellar from the front," Cole said. "No. There's a root cellar access on the north exterior wall of the house," he said. "I saw it when I first assessed the property. A coal door, hinged flat, probably frozen in. It would drop you into the stone storage area adjacent to the main cellar space." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know about that. It wasn't something you'd see from inside." He turned to look at her. "I can put you at the north wall while I draw their attention from the south side. You go in through the coal door, you get the documents, you get back to the horse. And you?" "I'll be fine." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her for a beat. "We'll meet at the tree line, east side, 200 yards from the barn. 10 minutes. She held his gaze. "What if it takes longer than 10 minutes to find the stones? Then I'll know and I'll adjust." "Cole, Evelyn." He said it firmly, but not harshly. "This is the best option we have. The ground on the north side of the house is lower, and there's a windbreak hedge that'll give you cover from the barn. I need you to trust the layout and move fast." A long pause. Then, "All right." They split up at the dead cottonwood 50 yards from the property edge. Cole took Hatch east in a wide arc, moving carefully in the snow, keeping to the brush line. Evelyn went north on foot, moving low and steady along the fence line, her silhouette barely distinguishable from the dark hedge against the gray sky. Cole watched her until she disappeared around the north corner of the house. Then he turned his attention to the barn. He came at the south face of the property from an angle, using the cold storage shed as partial cover, and tied Hatch to the back of it before moving the last 30 yards on foot. The snow was undisturbed on this approach. Nobody had come this way recently, which told him the men inside had come in from the valley trail and hadn't bothered to check the back perimeter, which told him something about their level of discipline. Not professionals. Hired men who were cold and impatient and hadn't been given precise orders about security protocols. That was something. Cole moved to the corner of the storage shed and looked around it at the barn. The big doors on the south face were cracked open about 2 feet, firelight visible through the gap. He could hear voices. Low, indistinct. The sound of men talking with the casual lack of attention that meant they weren't expecting anything to happen yet. He counted. 2 distinct voices, possibly 3. The barn, not the house. Which meant the farmhouse might be clear, or might have 1 or 2 men staged inside where it was warmer. He had no way to know that from here. He pulled the revolver and checked the cylinder. Full. He reholstered it and brought the Winchester up and put the barn door in the edge of his vision and waited. 60 seconds passed. Then a sound from the north side of the house. Faint. A single dull thud. The sound of a frozen hatch door being forced. Cole winced slightly. Not loud, but loud enough in the still morning air that someone paying attention might have caught it. He gave it 10 seconds to see if the voices in the barn changed. They did. One of them sharpened into something more alert, and then a man's head appeared in the gap of the barn door, looking north. Cole stepped out from the storage shed and put a rifle shot through the top board of the barn door, 6 inches above the man's head. The head disappeared. Shouting erupted from inside. What followed was not a clean or organized thing. Clean and organized things happened in stories people told afterward, when the chaos had been compressed into a comprehensible shape. What actually happened in the next several minutes was loud and cold and confusing and had too many moving parts for any of them to be fully in control of. 2 men came out of the barn at a run, angling toward the farmhouse, and Cole put a round in the snow in front of the first one, and the man skidded and went down, and the second one threw himself behind the water trough. Cole was already moving right, using the corner of the shed, and a shot came from the barn interior that threw snow up near his left boot, and he moved faster. Mercer. The voice came from somewhere above him and to the right, and he looked up and saw a man on the barn roof. The hayloft overhang, positioned there before dawn, patient, which meant at least one of these men had more sense than he'd given them credit for. The rifle barrel was tracking toward him. Cole threw himself left, and the shot hit the shed wall where he'd been, and he came up running toward the barn itself because the one direction the man above him couldn't angle on was directly beneath him. He hit the wall hard and pressed against it and heard boots scrambling on the roof above. A 4th shot came from the farmhouse. South window, 2nd floor. So the house was not clear. Cole processed this while flattened against the barn wall with the Winchester at a bad angle for anything above or to his right. The man behind the water trough not shooting yet, which meant he was waiting for a clear line, and someone on the roof and someone in the house. He had 12 rounds left in the rifle. His left side was starting to ache from where he'd hit the shed wall wrong. He took a breath, assessed the geometry, and moved. Inside the north wall of the farmhouse, Evelyn was on her stomach in 6 inches of frozen mud and old straw. The coal door had come open on the 3rd pull, the hinges shrieking briefly in the cold before the wood gave way, and she'd dropped into the stone storage space adjacent to the main cellar and landed harder than she'd intended on the uneven floor. Her right hip screamed at her. She ignored it. The storage space was small and dark, barely distinguishable from the cellar itself. The same stone walls, the same flat mineral smell, the same dead cold that went beyond temperature into something that felt almost intentional. She stayed still for a moment after the drop, listening, letting her eyes adjust to the near total darkness. Shots outside. Cole pulling attention south, which meant she had however long that lasted. She found the doorway between the storage space and the main cellar by feel, a low wooden frame, the door hanging open, the hinges rusted frozen. She went through and stood in the main cellar, and the smell hit her the way it hits you when you return to a place where something bad happened. Not the smell itself, exactly, just what the smell meant to her body, which still remembered 43 days of it and wanted very badly to go back up through the coal door immediately. She stood there for 3 full seconds and made her body understand that this was not then. Then she moved to the north wall. She found the chain anchor ring first, the iron ring still bolted to the stone where she'd spent 6 weeks, and used it as her reference point. 8 feet east. She counted it out in the dark, her fingers dragging along the stone, and found the section she'd heard shifting on cold nights. The first stone moved on the second try. Not much, just a slight rotation, but enough to confirm it was loose. She got her fingers around the edge and pulled, and it scraped free, maybe 8 pounds of rough granite, and she set it on the floor carefully, keeping the sound to a minimum. Behind it, nothing. Just stone and compacted earth. Outside, the shooting was getting sporadic. Short bursts of exchange, then silence, then another shot from somewhere, She couldn't tell how far it was going in Cole's favor. She found the second loose stone 2 inches right of the first gap. This one required more work. It had been seeded deliberately rather than just settling loose over time, mortared partway on one side with something that crumbled under her fingers, clay maybe, packed to look continuous. She worked at it, tearing her already damaged fingernails without particularly caring, and after a solid minute it came free, and she nearly dropped it and caught it against her chest and set it down. Behind the stone was a gap in the wall about 14 inches wide and 8 inches tall. Inside the gap was a leather document case. She pulled it out. It was wrapped in oilskin against the damp, tied with a leather cord, and heavier than she'd expected. Several hundred pages of accumulated agreements and deeds and witness statements. The entire architecture of the Valley's land trust, built over 20 years by her father, and now sitting in her hands in a burned-out cellar under a house currently being shot at. She held it against her chest and breathed for a moment. Then she heard the footsteps overhead. Not outside, inside the house. Someone coming through the kitchen above her, heavy, deliberate, moving toward the trapdoor. She looked up. The trapdoor was closed, but she could see the iron ring from below, and she could see it move slightly as someone above took hold of it. She had about 4 seconds. She went back through the doorway into the storage space, crossed it in 3 strides, went up through the coal door opening in a movement that cost her more than she had to spend but spent it anyway, and was on her feet on the north side of the house when she heard the trapdoor in the kitchen slam open behind and below her. She ran. Not a clean run. Her body wasn't built for clean running right now, and the snow was uneven and her hip was wrong and the document case was throwing her weight off. But she ran, staying close to the hedge line, heading east toward the tree line and the cottonwood, and she'd covered maybe 60 yards when she heard a man shout from behind her. She didn't look back. 40 yards to the trees. Well, Cole heard the shout from the north side of the house and knew what it meant and decided it was time to stop being careful. He'd been working the barn side engagement for the past several minutes from behind the water trough, which he'd reached by going low across the open ground between it and the barn wall when the man on the roof had shifted position and given him a gap. The man on the roof was now pinned by the angle. He couldn't shoot down without exposing himself to a return shot. And he knew it. And they'd been at an impasse for about 90 seconds. The man who'd been behind the trough originally had retreated to the barn. The man in the house window had gone quiet, which either meant Cole's second shot near that window had convinced him to be somewhere else, or meant he was moving to a different position, and neither possibility was entirely good. The shout from the north side simplified things. Cole stood up from behind the trough, fired twice through the barn door to keep heads down, and ran south and east around the outside of the farmhouse, moving hard in the snow, putting the building between himself and the barn. He came around the north corner at a run and nearly collided with Evelyn, who was moving the opposite direction at her own version of full speed, with a document case clutched to her chest and her hair coming out of its braid, and her expression fixed in the forward-leaning concentration of someone who has committed entirely to the next 20 yards. They adjusted around each other without stopping. "Get to the horse," Cole said without breaking stride. She was already going. He turned. The man from the house was 30 feet behind her, cutting across the north face yard at a diagonal, a heavy man with a dark coat and a revolver that he brought up when he saw Cole appear. Cole put a round from the Winchester past his left ear, close enough to part his hair, and the man flinched hard, and the shot went wide, and Cole covered 10 feet in the time the man took to recover his footing. They were at close quarters before either of them had expected to be. The man tried to bring the revolver around, and Cole got his left hand on the barrel and twisted it up and away, and the shot that discharged went somewhere into the sky. And then they were in each other in the cold mud and snow, and it was ugly and nothing like a story. 2 men in heavy winter coats with limited mobility trying to damage each other by whatever means were currently available, which were not many and not elegant. Cole was not a particularly large man, but he was built for the kind of work that the mountain required, and he'd spent 3 years at altitude doing it, and the man under him had been sitting in a warm barn for the past several hours, and had not been expecting this precise development in his morning. The revolver came free and went into the snow. Cole put 2 hard blows into the man's ribs, and the fight went out of him with a grunt. He was on his feet and moving before the man had finished deciding whether to get up or not. He sprinted east toward the tree line. They were in the saddle and moving inside of a minute, Hatch making no comment for once, heading back north along the frost-hardened trail, with both of them on him and the document case between Evelyn's arms, and the sound of shouting somewhere behind them getting smaller with distance. Cole pushed Hatch harder than he liked to, harder than was comfortable for any of them, until they were a solid mile up the slope with the tree cover thick on both sides and the ranch invisible below. Then he eased up. Evelyn was breathing hard. So was he. His left side had graduated from aching to something sharper and more insistent, and he thought he'd probably cracked something against the shed wall during the first engagement. But there was nothing to be done about that now. "You got it," he said. She looked down at the document case in her arms. "Yes." He wanted to say something, but the right thing wasn't immediately available, so he said nothing and kept Hatch moving north toward the cabin. After a while, she said, "There were more than 6. I counted 8, maybe 9. We were lucky." "We were fast," he said. "That's different from lucky." She didn't argue it. They were 3 miles up the trail, moving through a dense stand of pine that filtered the growing morning light into thin columns on the snow, when Evelyn said quietly, "He was there." Cole glanced back at her. "Silas?" "Yes, I saw him from the coal door when I came out, coming around the west side of the house." A pause. "He wasn't shooting, he was directing." "Where the men went?" "Yes, he saw me." Another pause, shorter. "He knew I had the case." Cole thought about that. "He'll come now," Cole said. "No more scouting." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Cole, I also saw something else." Something in her voice made him turn to look at her fully. She was staring at a point somewhere between the horse's ears, her jaw tight, her expression carrying a particular quality he hadn't seen on her face before. Not fear, not anger, but the specific expression of a person who has just had a belief they were nursing in secret destroyed in full daylight. "Riding with Silas," she said slowly, "on the west side. There was a man in a gray coat and a black hat, on a bay horse." She stopped. "I've known that horse for 12 years. It belongs to Edwin Barrett." The pine trees moved in a slow breath of wind above them. "Barrett was there," Cole said. "He was there," she said. "He's not in Helena waiting for news. He's here. He came with them." She pressed her lips together briefly. "My father trusted that man with everything." Cole turned back to the trail and kept them moving north. There was nothing useful to say about it. Some betrayals were too complete to be addressed with words, and this one had roots 12 years deep, and it had a living face attached to it now rather than a suspicion, and Evelyn was going to have to carry that up the mountain along with everything else. He felt the weight of it, and it wasn't even his to carry. He put his attention on the trail and on the sounds of the forest around them, and on the mathematics of what was coming. Silas Crow, 8 or 9 armed men, and now Edwin Barrett, who understood the documents well enough to know exactly what Evelyn had in her hands, and exactly what it would cost him if she delivered them to anyone with the authority to act on them. The cabin was 9 miles ahead. Whatever was going to happen next was going to happen there. Cole rode toward it with his jaw set and his ribs aching, and a woman behind him who had just watched the last uncertain thing in a long bad season become certain. The mountain said nothing about any of it. It rarely did. They made it back to the cabin with 2 hours to spare. Cole knew it was 2 hours because he knew Silas, or knew the type well enough. A man like that didn't ride hard on an unknown trail in winter daylight with 9 men and horses that had already been standing in a cold barn since before dawn. He'd water the animals, organize the approach, send scouts ahead to confirm the target location. Methodical. Patient in the way that dangerous men are patient when they're confident the outcome is already decided. 2 hours. Maybe a little more if Cole's luck held on the weather. His luck did not hold on the weather. By the time they got Hatch put away and themselves inside, the sky to the northwest had taken on the flat gray-white color that meant another front was moving in. Not as severe as the storm earlier in the week, but enough to cut visibility on the upper slope to maybe 100 yards and make the cold a genuine threat to anyone spending extended time outdoors. Cole looked at the sky for a moment before going inside. In different circumstances, incoming weather would be an advantage. It complicated the attackers' approach, reduced their visibility, made coordinated movement across unfamiliar terrain substantially harder. But it also meant the trail north, the only real route out of this part of the mountain, would close down within hours. which meant that if things went badly wrong inside the cabin, there was no retreating into the wilderness and waiting it out. They were staying, one way or another. He went inside. Evelyn had already put the document case on the table and opened it. She was moving through the contents with careful, quick hands, checking each section against what she knew should be there, her lips moving slightly as she cross-referenced documents from memory. Cole watched her for a moment. The focused efficiency of it, the way she handled each page like it was both fragile and enormously important, which it was. And then he went to work on the cabin. He brought both rifles to the east window and propped the second one, an older Winchester he kept as a backup, not as accurate but functional, against the wall within reach. He checked the revolver, reloaded 2 spent chambers, and put it on the shelf above the fireplace where it was accessible from almost anywhere in the room. He checked the bar on the door, solid, and the shutters on both windows, also solid, though the east shutter had a gap at the top corner that he reinforced with a folded piece of leather from the gear shelf. 14 sections, Evelyn said from the table, without looking up. All present. 3 of the witness documentation bundles are water damaged, but still legible. It's enough. She looked up then. It's more than enough. A territorial judge could void any forgeries Silas has filed in about 40 minutes with what's in this case. We have to get it to a judge first. I know. She looked at the window. The light was graying outside. How long do we have? Less than I'd like. He finished checking the south wall gap and straightened up. Evelyn, I need you on the east window. You saw how the tree line runs. Anyone coming through there will funnel into about a 30-yard gap before they reach open ground. That's where you focus. What's my range with the Winchester? 70 yards, comfortable. Past that, account for the cold affecting the load. He paused. You're not trying to kill every man out there. You're trying to make it expensive to come forward. There's a difference. She looked at him steadily. I understand the difference. I know you do. He said it without condescension, just confirming. She stood up from the table and came to the east window and looked out at the tree line with the evaluating attention he'd come to expect from her. She checked the rifle's action, worked the lever once, set it at the ready position against the window frame. The document case, Cole said. If something happens, if the cabin becomes untenable, you take it and you go north on foot. There's a trapper's line shack about 4 miles up. I've stayed in it twice. You stay there until it's clear. She turned from the window. And leave you. Yes. I'm not doing that. Evelyn, I'm not, she said with a finality that was not angry and was therefore harder to argue with. Stop planning for outcomes where you're the only one who doesn't make it out. It's not useful. Cole looked at her for a moment. He didn't have a good answer for that, so he let it go and went back to the south wall. The first shot came through the east window at 4:17 in the afternoon. Not from the tree line, from above it, from the slope that rose steeply to the right of the pine stand, where the granite outcropping that Cole had considered impassable from the north had a shelf on its southern face that a man could reach if he came at it from the right angle, with enough time and motivation. The shot blew through the shutter Cole had reinforced an hour ago, split the leather he'd wedged in the corner, and took a chunk out of the wall 4 inches above the window frame. Evelyn had already moved back from the window before the echo finished. Cole was at the south wall. Tree line, he said. They've got someone high on the right. I see him. She was back at the window edge, not in front of it, angled so she could see the slope without being fully exposed. He's got a good position up there. Another shot from the high position, this one lower, finding the gap in the shutter properly, and the bullet came through the interior and punched into the fireplace stone with a sharp crack. Cole crossed to the east window in 4 strides and looked up the slope. The man was on a narrow shelf, maybe 80 yards up and 120 out, partially screened by a rock lip above him. A good position. He'd spent real time getting there. He was the priority, because as long as he held that shelf, he could angle shots into the cabin interior that the shutters and walls couldn't reliably stop. Cole brought the Winchester up, calculated the elevation and the cold, and waited for the man to shift position for his next shot. The shelf was narrow. When the man moved to reposition, he'd have to show his right shoulder. He moved. Cole fired. The man's rifle dropped off the shelf ledge and clattered down the rock face. A moment later, the man himself pulled back out of sight entirely, and Cole couldn't tell if he was hit badly or just had enough sense to move when a return shot came close. It didn't matter. The shelf position was gone. South side, Evelyn said sharply. Cole heard it too. Boots in the snow, the creak of the willow stand, and then the first trap going off with a flat metallic clank and a shout of pain that was audible clearly through the cabin walls. Cole went to the south gap. 3 men moving through the willow draw, one of them down and not moving, one of them stopped and looking at the fallen man with the momentary paralysis that hits people who aren't used to seeing trap injuries. The third still pushing forward with a rifle up. Cole put a round through the snow in front of the third man's feet. The man stopped. Wire, Evelyn said from the east window. They hit the wire. 2 of them down. Cole looked back at the willow draw. The second man had recovered his composure and was moving again, angling toward the cabin's south wall with better sense than his companion, using the willow trunks for cover. How many on the east approach? Cole called. 3 moving through the trees, 1 hung up on the wire, 2 still coming. A pause. 2 shots in quick succession, hers. 1 still coming. The exchange that followed was not what anyone would call controlled. It was loud and fragmented and expensive in ammunition, and it didn't go as well as the early traps and wire had suggested it might. The men coming at the cabin were not all inexperienced. Some of them had done this kind of work before, and they adapted when the initial approach routes failed, and they found angles that Cole hadn't fully accounted for. A shot came through the west shutter and took out the oil lamp above the table, spraying burning oil across the corner of the room. Cole got his coat over it in time to smother it before it caught the wall properly, burning his left hand in the process. And by the time he got back to his position, Evelyn had held the east window through 2 more shots and was reloading with her hands working fast and steady. How many left? Cole said. I've accounted for 3 on the east side. I don't know about the south. Cole looked through the south gap. 1 man visible in the willow stand, staying put, not advancing, covering, keeping Cole occupied while others moved. He didn't know where the others were, which was the problem. Then the front door shuddered. Not a shot. Impact. Someone hitting it with something heavy, shoulder or boot, testing the bar. Cole turned and put 2 rounds through the door at waist height, and the impact stopped. Cole? Evelyn's voice had changed. Not louder, but different, with something concentrated in it. He looked at her. She was staring at the east window, not at the tree line. Past it, toward the lower slope. Smoke, not from a chimney. From the eastern edge of the clearing, where the dry pine brush at the tree line met the wind-blown accumulation of dead branches Cole had never gotten around to clearing. Someone had set it alight, and in the wind it was moving faster than it should have. They're going to push us out, Cole said, or burn us in. She pulled back from the window as a shot came through. Cole, if that fire reaches the cabin, I know. He was already thinking. The fire was east, and the wind was pushing it west and slightly north toward the cabin. It would reach the east wall in minutes, and once the wall caught the pine log construction would go fast. The north side was granite. The south was the willow draw with the remaining men in it. The west was the open slope, and the open slope had men on it too because he'd heard boots out there 20 minutes ago. Every direction was a problem. That was when the door came in. Not the bar giving way. Someone had gotten to the porch and done something to the upper hinge, and the door came off its frame at an angle and swung inward, and a man came through it fast and low. Cole caught him with the rifle butt across the shoulder, and the man went into the table and took it down with him, and for a moment the cabin was full of scrambling and shouting and the smell of gun smoke and the distant orange glow through the east window of the fire growing in the tree line. Evelyn put the revolver against the ceiling and fired once, loud enough to momentarily stop everything, and said in a clear voice, "Get up slowly." The man on the floor looked at her. He got up slowly. "Out," she said, gesturing with the revolver toward the broken doorway. The man looked at Cole, who had the rifle pointed at him, and made the calculation correctly, and went out through the broken door with his hands visible. Cole followed him to the porch and watched him cross the clearing at a run, heading for the tree line, and heard him shouting something to the other men. A brief silence followed, the particular kind that happens when a group of armed men receives unexpected information and has to revise their understanding of the situation. Cole used the silence. He went back inside. "The fire's going to cut off the east trail in about 10 minutes, he told Evelyn. "We need to move now or we're waiting it out in the cabin, and that means at least 4 hours before the fire burns down enough to travel through." "There are still men out there." Fewer than there were. He looked at her. They've been at this for 40 minutes and they haven't taken the cabin. That changes the math for hired men. She thought about it for about 3 seconds, which was the right amount of time. The south approach. Through the willow draw. There's 1 man left in the draw, maybe 2. The traps took out 2 already. He checked the Winchester. 6 rounds left. We go through the draw and we stay south until we hit the lower trail, then east toward the valley road. The documents. She already had the case. She'd tied it across her back with the carry strap, while Cole had been dealing with the man at the door. A decision she'd made on her own in the middle of a firefight that he noted without comment because there was no time for comment. They went out through the broken door at a run. The willow draw was dark and cold and full of the smell of the traps that had already been sprung, and 1 man was still in it, positioned behind the largest willow trunk about 40 yards in. He heard them coming and rose, and Cole shot once, high and right of him, and the man dropped flat and stayed there, and they went past him before he'd decided what to do about it. They came out the south end of the draw onto the lower slope, and Cole pulled Evelyn left toward the rock face, and they went along it at a fast walk, keeping the stone at their backs, moving east. Behind them the cabin was visible above the willow stand, the east wall catching now, orange light flickering in the window frames, smoke rising into the gray sky. Cole did not look at it for long. 3 years of work burning down was a fact. A fact could be acknowledged and then set aside, because standing and looking at facts was not useful right now. They were 200 yards east along the slope when they heard Silas. "Mercer." The voice came from up the slope, from somewhere in the pine stand to the north of their current position, deep and unhurried. The voice of a man who had decided that the urgency was over. Cole pulled Evelyn into the shadow of a rock outcropping and put his hand up. They listened. Boots in the snow. 1 set moving carefully, and then a second set slightly further back, not rushing. "You got my boys turned around pretty good," Silas called, conversationally. "I'll give you that. But you're out in the open now, and I know these rocks better than you think." Cole looked at Evelyn. She had the revolver in her right hand and the document case across her back, and her eyes were tracking the sound with the same focused attention she brought to everything. She mouthed, "2 of them." Cole nodded. Silas was still talking, the way certain men do when they believe the conversation is already over, and they're just filling the remaining time. "That woman you've been helping, you know what she's carrying? You know what that costs me if she gets it to the right people?" Cole said nothing. "I'm not angry," Silas said. "That's what I want you to understand. A man finds a woman in a hole and feels obligated. That's human nature. I understand that." A pause, and his voice had moved slightly north. "But this is finished now. Give me the case, and I'll let you both walk." Evelyn looked at Cole. He looked back at her, and she read his expression correctly because she shook her head slowly, once, and he gave her a slight nod that said he knew. Silas wasn't going to let anyone walk. Cole picked up a stone from the ground near his boot and threw it hard to the left, into the pine stand. It hit a branch and clattered down through the needles, and the second set of boots in the snow moved toward the sound immediately, which told him the second man was less experienced than Silas and was working on instinct. Cole moved right. He came around the east side of the outcropping, and Silas was 30 feet away, closer than Cole had calculated, a large man in a heavy coat with a revolver held low at his side, and eyes that were already moving to where Cole appeared with a speed that told you everything you needed to know about how he'd survived 15 years in this valley. The revolver came up. Cole's rifle was already at his shoulder. 2 shots, near simultaneous, the sound of them rolling together into one flat crack against the rock face. Cole felt something tear along his left side below the ribs. Not a full hit, the edge of it. The bullet catching the meat of his side and opening something that immediately started making itself known with considerable insistence. He went down on one knee from the impact. Silas had gone down too, but from the way he went down it wasn't a solid hit, and he was already pushing back up with the revolver still in hand and blood on his right shoulder, not slowing him enough, not nearly enough. Cole tried to stand and his left side didn't cooperate fully, and he made it to his feet, but not with the speed he needed, and Silas was 4 steps away and the revolver was tracking toward his face. The shot that came was not Cole's. It came from the outcropping behind him, and it took Silas in the shoulder, the same shoulder already hit, or just below it, and the revolver spun out of his hand and disappeared into the snow, and Silas made a sound that was mostly rage and sat down hard. Cole turned. Evelyn was standing at the edge of the outcropping with the revolver extended, both hands, her aim carrying the slight tremor of someone who has just done something irreversible and whose body is beginning to process it. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were steady. "Stay down," she said to Silas. Her voice was flat and even. Silas looked up at her from the snow with an expression that had shed all of its earlier conversational pleasantness and was now just what was underneath it, which was considerable and dark. Then his eyes went to Cole, then to the document case on Evelyn's back. "That case doesn't save you," Silas said. His voice had roughened. "There are people behind this you don't know about, people with more reach than you can—" "Barrett," Evelyn said. Silas stopped. "Edwin Barrett," she said. "I saw him at the ranch this morning, on his bay horse." She kept the revolver on him. "I've known Edwin Barrett my entire life. I can identify him in any court in the territory. I can speak to his relationship with my father and his access to those documents, and his financial interest in the water rights." A pause. "The case isn't the only evidence, Silas. I am." Something moved in Silas's expression, the recalculation of a man who has been operating on a set of assumptions that have just been invalidated. He thought Evelyn was the problem that could be solved by taking the case. He was understanding now that it was the other way around. The second man came crashing through the pine stand to the left, saw the scene, Cole bleeding and on his feet, Silas on the ground, Evelyn with the revolver, and stopped completely still with the particular paralysis of someone who has arrived at the end of a situation rather than the middle of it. "Put it down," Cole said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, the pain in his side starting to climb the register from manageable to something more demanding. "Put it down and walk back toward the valley." The man looked at Silas. Silas said nothing. The man put his rifle in the snow and walked back toward the valley. Cole stood in the cold with blood running down his left side, soaking into the waistband of his trousers and starting to make the cold worse in a way that had a specific kind of urgency to it. He looked at Silas sitting in the snow with 2 shoulder wounds and the particular deflated quality of a man whose plan has reached its terminus. "Can you ride?" Evelyn said behind him. Cole considered the question honestly. "I can ride." "The wound needs—" "I know what it needs." He turned and looked at her. She was still holding the revolver on Silas with one hand and looking at Cole with the other part of her attention, and the combination of those two things, the steadiness of the gun hand and the concern in her eyes, said something about who she was that he didn't have the right words for right then. "There's a length of rope in my saddlebag," he said. "Hatch is in the lean-to if the fire hasn't—" "I'll check." She looked at Silas. "If he moves toward town and we let him." Cole crouched down next to Silas, which cost him. Up close, the man was older than he'd seemed from a distance, late 50s, the deep lines of someone who'd spent decades outdoors and had not had an easy relationship with most of those decades. His eyes were dark and tired and still calculating, even now. "Where's Barrett going?" Cole said. "He saw us ride out of that ranch with the case. Where does he run?" Silas looked at him for a long time. "Helena," he said finally. "He's got a man at the Territorial Records office. If he gets there first, how far ahead is he?" 3 hours. A pause. "Maybe less." Cole stood up. His side told him what it thought of that. He walked toward the lean-to and found Hatch standing in it, alive and deeply unimpressed by the smoke and noise of the past hour, ears rotated to maximum indignation. Cole leaned against the horse's neck for a moment with his eyes closed and one hand pressed against the wound in his side, just gathering what he had left. "I know," he said. Hatch flicked one ear forward slightly, which was as close to sympathy as the horse had ever managed. Cole straightened up and started getting the saddle back on. They rode through the night. There was no good alternative. Barrett had 3 hours on them, maybe less according to Silas, and the Territorial Records office in Helena opened at 8 in the morning, which meant if Barrett reached his contact there before they reached anyone with the authority to stop him, the forgeries would be filed and the legal machinery of undoing them would take months. Months during which families lost water access, cattle died, operations folded, and the valley quietly bled out while lawyers argued in rooms far from the land itself. Cole knew all of this and rode with it sitting on him alongside the wound in his side which had stopped bleeding freely after Evelyn bound it with strips torn from the lining of his spare coat, but had not stopped making its opinion known. Every jarring step on frozen ground sent a specific message up through his left side that he received and acknowledged and set aside with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been injured in remote places before and understood that the injury's schedule and his own were not always going to align. Evelyn rode Hatch and Cole rode a horse they'd borrowed from the problem. One of Silas's men had left a solid-looking roan tied at the east edge of the property when things had gone badly wrong for them, and the roan had no particular objection to being appropriated. It was not as good a horse as Hatch, but it had 4 legs and was willing, which was the minimum requirement. They didn't talk much in the first hours. The trail demanded attention, and the cold demanded energy, and there wasn't a surplus of either. Evelyn rode slightly ahead where the trail was wide enough, the document case still strapped across her back, and Cole watched her from behind and thought about a woman who had spent 43 days in a stone cellar building the exact plan she was now executing, and who had done it without anyone to talk to or any certainty that she would survive long enough to try. That was a particular kind of strength, not the loud kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself. Around midnight, they stopped briefly at a creek crossing to water the horses and eat what little Cole had packed. The cold was deep and still, and the stars above the mountain were painfully clear, the kind of sky that only appeared when the temperature had pushed everything else out of the atmosphere. Evelyn sat on a flat rock at the creek edge and looked at the water moving black between the ice shelves on either bank and said, without preamble, "When this is over, what happens to you?" Cole looked at her. "The cabin's gone," she said. It wasn't a question. They'd both seen it burning as they rode south. "I know." "You lost 3 years of work." "I know that too." She looked at him. "You don't seem particularly destroyed by it." He thought about how to say the next thing honestly without it sounding like something it wasn't. "I built that cabin because I needed somewhere to be. I stayed in it because leaving felt like admitting something." He paused. "I'm not entirely sure what I was planning to do up there for the next 30 years. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the water. "I've been thinking about what comes after this. About going back to Helena. My father's practice, the estate, the invitations from people who'll expect me to return to the life I had before." She turned a small stone over in her fingers. 3 months ago, I would have wanted that. I thought I wanted that. And now, she set the stone down. Now I think I was confusing comfort with wanting. A pause. They feel similar from the inside until something strips the comfort away and you find out what's actually underneath it. Cole said nothing, which seemed like the right response. She stood up. "We should keep moving." They kept moving. They came into the outskirts of Helena at just past 6 in the morning, the town still mostly dark, wood smoke rising from chimneys into the cold blue air of early winter dawn. Cole's side had stiffened badly during the long ride, and he dismounted carefully and slowly, which Evelyn watched without comment, for which he was grateful. The federal marshal's office was on the main street, a squat stone building that looked permanent in the way that government buildings did when they were trying to convince a frontier town that the rule of law was here to stay. Cole had been inside it twice in his life. Once to file a stolen livestock report that went nowhere. Once to drop off a man he'd found squatting on a neighboring rancher's property. The duty marshal that morning was a man named Calloway, red-haired and heavy-set and not fully awake when Cole knocked on the door at 6:15. He looked at Cole and Evelyn. Cole visibly injured, Evelyn carrying a leather case and wearing a coat 2 sizes too large, with the cautious expression of a man who had learned over years that early morning visitors usually brought complicated problems. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge of territorial fraud cases," Cole said. Calloway looked him over. "That would be Marshal Greer. He's not in until—" "Get him in." Cole said it evenly, without aggression, just as a statement of what needed to happen. "Tell him Evelyn Marlowe is here. Tell him she has the original Marlowe Land Trust documents. And tell him Edwin Barrett is somewhere in this town right now trying to file forged deeds at the Territorial Records Office before 8 o'clock. Calloway looked at Evelyn. She met his eyes and said nothing. She didn't need to. There was something in the way she stood, the document case on her back, the stillness of a person who has been through worse things than an unconvinced lawman, that communicated more than additional words would have. Calloway went to get Marshal Greer. What followed was not swift or elegant in the way that frontier justice sometimes appeared in the stories people told about it afterward. It was slow and bureaucratic and involved a great deal of documentation and several hours in a cold office where Cole's side informed him with increasing urgency that it would appreciate some medical attention, and where Evelyn sat across from two federal marshals and a hastily summoned territorial judge and answered questions for 3 hours straight from memory, without the documents in front of her, reconstructing the legal architecture of the land trust from a mind that had spent 6 weeks in a stone cellar with nothing to do but hold on to everything it knew. She did not miss a single detail. Cole sat in a chair against the wall and watched her do it and thought that whatever Silas Crow had been trying to destroy when he put her in that cellar, he had not understood what he was dealing with. Edwin Barrett was located at a boarding house 4 blocks from the records office at 7:40 in the morning, 20 minutes before it opened. He had the forged documents in a leather satchel under his bed and a ticket for the eastbound coach in his coat pocket, which together told a fairly complete story. He was a thin man in his mid-50s with the groomed appearance of someone who had spent his career in offices and the particular gray look of a person who has been awake all night waiting for something that has not gone the way it was supposed to. When the marshals brought him in, he looked at Evelyn across the room and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything. Cole watched it. The 12 years of professional trust between them, all of it visible in the space between their eyes as it collapsed completely and permanently. Barrett looked away first. Evelyn did not look away at all. They kept him in a separate room. Cole had his wound seen to by a doctor who came in around 9, a brisk woman named Dr. Halls, who examined it with efficient disinterest and told him he'd been fortunate in a tone that suggested she'd seen considerably more unfortunate outcomes, and found his case only moderately interesting. The bullet had torn through the muscle below his lowest rib without hitting anything that couldn't heal, which was luck or trajectory or both, and she stitched it and bandaged it and told him not to ride hard for 2 weeks, to which he said nothing because 2 weeks was not a timeline he could commit to right now. She gave him the look that doctors give patients who say things like that and moved on. Thomas Marlowe arrived in Helena 3 days later. Cole was there when he came through the marshal's office door. Still moving carefully from the stitches, sitting in the same chair against the wall where he seemed to have taken up semi-permanent residence over the past 72 hours of statements and documentation and the grinding procedural work of legal reckoning. Evelyn was at the table going through documents with one of the territorial attorneys, her third such session in as many days, the fatigue of it visible in the set of her shoulders, but not in the precision of what she was doing. She heard her father's voice before she saw him. She stood up from the table and turned around, and Thomas Marlowe, a tall, spare man in his 60s with the kind of face that showed every year of 20 years spent protecting other people's claims, stopped in the doorway and looked at his daughter. Cole looked at the floor. He wasn't there for that moment, and didn't try to be. What he heard was the kind of quiet that happens when two people who have been on opposite sides of a very long absence find each other again, and there are no words adequate to the distance, so neither of them reaches for words first. After a while, Thomas Marlowe said something low that Cole couldn't hear, and Evelyn said something back, and then it was quiet again for a different reason. Cole went to get coffee. The legal resolution took longer than the dramatic events that preceded it, as legal resolutions generally do. Barrett's financial records, once subpoenaed, told a story that was cleaner and more damning than even Evelyn had suspected. He'd been working with a consortium of Helena land speculators for over 2 years, engineering the theft of the Valley Trust documents as the centerpiece of a scheme to acquire water rights across 3 counties and sell them to railroad development interests moving into the territory. Silas Crow had been a paid instrument. Well paid, it turned out, though not well enough since the fees a territorial prison charged were considerably higher than what he'd received for his participation. Silas was remanded to federal custody in late December. He didn't give Barrett up willingly. Cole had expected him not to because whatever else Silas was, he wasn't the kind of man who collapsed easily. But the evidence didn't require his cooperation. Barrett's own ledgers made the cooperation unnecessary. The forged deeds that had been partially filed in 2 county offices were voided by the territorial court in January. The Marlowe Trust documents were formally recorded and their authenticity confirmed by 3 independent attorneys, which made them substantially more bulletproof than they'd been before someone had tried to destroy them. The Valley's families got their water rights back. Most of them didn't know how close they'd come to losing them permanently, and the people who did know made a collective decision not to dwell on it at length, because the frontier had a way of presenting you with the version of your history that you could afford to carry forward, and the version where the land trust held and the Valley survived was the one worth keeping. Cole heard about most of this secondhand, from letters and from the occasional visit to town over the winter months. He had other things occupying his attention. The Crow property, technically, was still his. He'd bought it legally, and the legal status hadn't changed regardless of what had transpired in and around it since the purchase. The farmhouse was burned out now. Silas's men had finished what the earlier engagement had started before they'd scattered. But the barn was standing and the land was good, and the water rights, as it turned out, were worth considerably more now that the Valley Trust was formally intact, and the creek access they represented was part of a protected network rather than an isolated and vulnerable claim. He spent the winter rebuilding, not quickly, not gracefully. Frontier construction in January at altitude was exactly as miserable as it sounds, and Cole spent several days questioning every decision he'd made in the past 2 years, which was a familiar enough mental state that he'd gotten reasonably efficient at getting through it. His ribs healed badly on the left side, not dangerously, just with a slight irregularity that left a permanent tenderness along the lower edge that he noticed on cold mornings for the rest of his life. Evelyn came back in February. She came with her father initially on the legal business of formally filing the trust documents with the county recorder, which took 2 days and required a ride out to several of the Valley ranches to witness signatures. Cole rode with them on that circuit, knowing the terrain, and watched Evelyn sit at the kitchen tables of families who'd spent the winter not knowing how close they'd come to losing everything, who shook her hand and thanked her without fully understanding what the thanks was for. She accepted it without correcting them, which told him something. On the second evening, they were back at the property, standing outside the partially rebuilt barn in the February cold, the valley spread out below them in the long blue shadow of late afternoon. Thomas Marlowe had gone inside. Cole and Evelyn stood in the cold with their breath coming out in clouds and looked at the valley. "My father wants me to come back to Helena," she said. "I know. He has the practice to rebuild. There are a lot of families that need the trust properly redocumented now that the originals are filed." She paused. "He needs help. He trusts." "He's right." She looked at him sideways. "You're being very agreeable about this." "I'm agreeing with what's true," he said. "That's different from being agreeable." She almost smiled. He'd noticed she did that, approached a smile and then seemed to reconsider, as though smiling fully still required some kind of trust she was still in the process of rebuilding. He didn't take it personally. Some things that have been locked away in the dark for a long time take a while to come back to the light without flinching. "I'll be in Helena through March," she said, "and then I need to come back to do the follow-up filings for the eastern section of the valley and to check on the Hendricks family because their water access is still being disputed by the neighboring claim. And it needs someone here who can read the original language and—" "Evelyn." She stopped. He looked at her. "You don't have to give me a legal justification for coming back." She was quiet for a moment. The valley below them was going from blue to gray as the light dropped, the way it did at this altitude in winter, the dark coming down from the peaks first and filling in toward the flat ground. "No," she said finally. "I suppose I don't." They stood there for a while in the cold, not saying anything particularly, just standing in the place where a burned-out outlaw's ranch was slowly becoming something else, looking at land that a lot of people had tried very hard to take and had failed, for reasons that had more to do with too stubborn and imperfect people than with any legal document, though the document had mattered too. Cole thought about what the valley had looked like from the slope above. The first morning he'd ridden down to assess his new property with ice in his beard and a horse that disapproved of everything. He'd been looking for water rights, something simple and practical and finite. He'd found considerably more than that, and it had cost him his cabin and a piece of his side and several months of sleep, and he was not entirely sure it wouldn't cost him more before it was finished. He was also not sorry. That was the part that surprised him, if he was being honest with himself. Not the events themselves, not the decisions, but the absence of regret on the other side of them. He'd spent 3 years on a mountain avoiding anything that required him to care what happened next, and somewhere between a locked trapdoor and a burning ranch house and a long dark ride to Helena that had stopped being something he was capable of. Some thresholds you crossed without noticing until you were too far past them to see the line anymore. Thomas Marlowe appeared in the barn doorway behind them. "Coffee's ready," he said, in the simple way of a man who understood that some conversations needed an unhurried ending and that coffee was usually the right mechanism for providing one. They went inside. The barn was warm, the stove Cole had installed throwing serious heat into the patched and rebuilt space. The coffee was strong, and the evening came down fully outside the single window, and the three of them sat around the rough table with their cups and didn't talk about land rights or legal documents or burned buildings or any of it. Just talk the way people talk when the hard part is over, and the next thing is still ahead and there's a fire going and nowhere particularly urgent to be. Outside, the valley settled into winter dark. The creek that ran through the lower pasture, the whole reason Cole had bought this property to begin with, moved quietly under its shelf of ice, carrying water downhill the way it had been doing for longer than anyone in the territory could remember, indifferent to all the human drama that had surrounded the question of who had the right to use it. It ran through the Crowland, Cole's land now, and through the Hendricks property and past the eastern ranches and down into the main valley, where 30 families had spent the winter, not knowing that the water their livestock drank had almost been taken from them by men sitting in warm rooms calculating the value of what other people had built. It kept running. Cole listened to it from inside the barn, underneath the conversation and the sound of the fire, the way you learn to hear water on a mountain property after years of needing it, the sound of a thing that doesn't care about your plans or your setbacks or the gap between what you hoped for and what you got. It just runs. It just keeps going. And if you're sensible about it, you build your life in a place that gives you access to it, and then you stay. He thought that was probably as close to wisdom as he was going to get on the subject. He drank his coffee and let the evening do what evenings were supposed to do, which was end the day and make room for whatever came next. And he found that after everything, he was genuinely curious about what that was going to be. That was new. That was, he thought, enough.